Is Charles Taylor's account of modernity and secularization in the modern West merely philosophical idealism? Or is it materialistic? Or is it neither? Well, that's what Chapter 5 of A Secular Age is all about. Let me tell you a little bit about it. Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz. Okay, I just finished Chapter 5. We're continuing our long, slow march through the massive, masterful work by Charles Taylor of cultural theory and philosophy called A Secular Age. Chapter 5 closes out part 1 of the book, which is called The Work of Reform. And so this chapter is actually quite short, so this video probably won't be super long. I'm going to just tee up a few of the concepts of Chapter 5, maybe give a few comments on kind of part 1 of the book as a whole before we move on into part 2, which is called The Turning Point. So, The Spectre of Idealism, Chapter 5, is, in many ways, it's kind of a short, it's almost a little bit of a parenthetical in the overarching argument, I think, is a way to read it. And in some ways, it's kind of a refutation or a rebuttal to a potential philosophical critique that Charles Taylor could get. That critique would be that he is putting forward a purely philosophically idealistic argument, historical idealism. And what that means is not, and idealistic doesn't mean in the sense of naive or optimistic, like we would use in kind of popular verbiage, but it refers in a philosophical sense to an argument that ideas, abstract, non-tangible, non-material ideas are what move history forward. So it's that ideas occur to people and then people act on ideas. That would be the idealistic argument, the idealistic frame. And he is concerned about being accused of that, and so he includes this short chapter to kind of rebut that notion. The opposite of idealism would be materialism, which is just the inverse, which would be that it's actually material or economic factors, events that move history and progress and humanity through history. They do actions. Actions are what precede ideas. Those would be kind of the two poles: idealism, materialism. And Charles Taylor, which some people get really frustrated at him, I think, for this, but he kind of just refuses to concede that he's either. He kind of says it's both and. In fact, he talks in Chapter 5 that that's a really maybe unhelpful dichotomy, way to frame and force kind of a binary. And he basically, Chapter 5 is him essentially saying, I'm not idealistic, but he is arguing that ideas, and this is kind of Hegelian dialectic stuff going on, that ideas and material factors dialectically play off of each other, and that he actually says they're impossible to disentangle. That sometimes sometimes ideas come first and they do spark actions, but the reverse could be quite plausibly true. That humans are forced by economic realities or tangible realities, and then it's the acting that then sparks new ideas, which then cycle back and inform new actions, and vice versa. Honestly, in a sentence or two, that is what Chapter 5 is all about, is he's trying to argue that his whole account of secular age is not neatly idealistic nor materialistic, but he is trying to pay attention to both ideas and material factors in kind of the movement of humans through this major shift from the world of antiquity to the world of modernity. Part of what comes with that shift is the advent of exclusive secular humanism as kind of a contested belief option, which I've been talking about in each of these chapter commentary videos. So that's the Spectre of Idealism. The Spectre of Idealism is him kind of not naming the specter hanging over his argument, and trying to say it's not purely idealistic nor purely materialistic. This is a chapter that's specifically really, really, really in the philosophical kind of world of philosophical argumentation. And so having said all of that, he goes through some examples in the chapter of some examples of ideas and material factors that have caused the shift. Particularly, he talks a lot about kind of the shifting conceptions of civility, politeness, the shifting roles of nobility, the ways that certain social movement was more possible than in the ancient world, that people could move up, so to speak, the social ladder and down the social ladder in unprecedented ways as humanity kind of moved through the 17th century. coming out of the era of the Reformation and all of that. So he does get into some of those specific examples to tease out this materialistic idealistic interplay, but it's only a few pages long, so he doesn't really linger on it. And so what I wanted to do with the next few minutes of this video, just to finish this out, is to make a few comments on part one as a whole, because this argument closes out part one. And so part one, the work of reform, is a lot of argumentation about kind of the historical groundwork, the shifts, historical and philosophical shifts that were happening in that really paved the way for the advent of humans to move into what we know as modernity, the modern moral order. So I've talked at great length in the previous videos, in the previous chapters, about things like the rise of civility, things like the leveling out of society, the ways that certain unintended consequences of kind of making everything sacred in terms of all vocations, and kind of the great, leveling out of all roles in the social life. Leveling all that out in a sacred sense actually had the reverse effect of making everything kind of secular. If everything was sacred, then nothing was sacred, and it was one way to think about it. Talking about the disembedding in terms of the social fabric, talking about the kind of removal of hierarchical roles, all of that stuff. And one big takeaway from all of it for me, as I'm kind of rereading this material again, that's really been pressing back on me, is the work that was required. So the work of reform is not a misnomer in the title of this first part of the book, but it was a lot of work to put forward this alternate kind of social imaginary, to use the term from chapter 4. And I think that's a really important takeaway from part 1 of this book, of A Secular Age, is to say that in counter to his, what he tries to counter, the idea of the subtraction stories, or the idea that the inevitable slide towards secularism that is so kind of popular in a lot of discourse today, is that we just needed to slough off myth and superstition, and it was going to happen with the march of progress. We were going to get there anyways. A really big takeaway, an important takeaway from this book, and it's underlined again in the chapter 5, Spectre of Idealism, is that this was real work. To march into this new age was a lot of work, intentional work. It took a lot of work to push the idea of civility and even etiquette and politeness, to push that idea out to permeate all of human society, as opposed to just the nobles, the aristocrats. But to level out all of society took a ton of work. To try to bring the sense of the sacred to every vocation, to the farmer as well as the priest, or as well as the nun, so to speak. That took a lot of work to get people on board with that project. It took a lot of intentional effort, the work of reform. And that is just really striking as you kind of take a step back from part 1 as a whole, that creating this new social imaginary was not inevitable. It was certainly not lazy. It was not the, an unimagined destiny that humanity just kind of stumbled into. But it was a lot of work and a lot of intention to actually kind of usher in this new age. And that the last thing I want to say about all this, that he ends the Spectre of Idealism, he ends chapter 5 on this note, that this really is a new age. In the grand scope of human history, the modern moral order, the advent of kind of Western, what would become secular, broadly secular human society, is unprecedented in the history of humanity, in the history of the recorded history of the world, at least. It is really unprecedented. It is new. It's a new epoch, is the word that he uses. And that, combined with the work notion that I just mentioned, I think really nuances and shifts, maybe stretches the paradigm that a lot of people popularly kind of carry with them about the history of humanity and the place of the modern West in that history. It was not inevitable. And it really did not have any precedent, but it didn't have any precedent in the sense, sometimes people talk about, even if they don't interrogate or examine these presuppositions, they'll think about the West as this super enlightened. Enlightenment is not, that's not a mistake there either in that terminology, but they'll implicitly think of the West as a super enlightened, smart, science-driven, progress-driven age that was unprecedented in its intelligence. But Taylor's argument agrees with the unprecedentedness, but pushes back hard against the inevitability, or the kind of received specialness of it. But it was actually not inevitable, and a ton of work and a ton of effort to actually summon up this new kind of way of imagining ourselves in the world, and this new way of functioning, which would unintentionally, I think, in his argument, pave the way for the emergence of exclusive humanism and broad adoption of secularism. So those are my thoughts on Chapter 5, the last part of the work of reform, the Chapter 5, the Spectre of Idealism, and Charles Taylor's work, A Secular Age. Thank you to those of you who've been tracking with me along these videos. And it's been really enjoyable for me to kind of slowly work my way back through this text again and put these out there. So if this sparks thoughts, questions, other ideas, as always, let me know. But I look forward to catching back up with this book in the next chapter and getting into the next section of A Secular Age called The Turning Point. Thanks as always for watching.